As Seoul and Beijing seek to advance ties, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to South Korea is raising fresh questions about their strategic relationship and what comes next. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Thursday, August 20th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. As Seoul and Beijing seek to strengthen ties amid shifting U.S. security policy and renewed attention to diplomacy with North Korea, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's latest visit to South Korea is putting the spotlight on what both sides hope to gain and where their relationship could be headed next. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with the American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, it's great to have you here.
Thanks, great to be here.
I also have Fabian Kretschmer with German news agency DPA with us. Fabian, welcome back.
Great to be here.
Thomas, we start with you. Let's begin with what has been disclosed about the discussions between President Myung and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the Blue House earlier on this Thursday.
Right, so we still don't have an official readout or report that I've seen yet. Just before we went on air, we saw some little notes online on social media quoting Wang Yi, just basically saying that praising improved relations between Seoul and Beijing and saying something like we are friendly and close neighbors forever. That's really all I've seen concretely, post these meetings. But, we know a little bit about what they said was expected to be discussed between Wang and President Lee. And Wang also met National Security Advisor Sung-lac today. So, basically they ahead of time, the Blue House and Foreign Ministry were saying that discussions were basically meant to, talk about expanding mutual cooperation, ties ahead of the 35th anniversary of diplomatic relations next year, and talk about security issues, and this is coming. The timing of this is just after President Lee gave a Liberation Day address talking about, basically a blueprint for peaceful coexistence on the Korean Peninsula. And, there's a sense that, China would be a part of that, sort of a multi-party approach to finding, some form of peace on the Korean Peninsula. Lee had mentioned wanting to formally put an end to the Korean War. So I think that's clearly going to be one of the topics they meant to discuss. And, obviously it's coming at, an interesting time during this week of, the joint military exercises starting and then being cut short, and some back and forth between Washington and North Korea's response and South Korea's response to hoping to sort of push forward some new level of diplomacy with the North. So I think some that will clearly be part of the discussion as well. What role maybe China could play in trying to facilitate a new round of discussions, as well as sort of maybe just taking the temperature of where things stand regionally in terms of military issues and defense issues. So, again, though, we'll see more, I think, later today.
Right, indeed. Fabian, ahead of his appointment at the Blue House on this Thursday, Wang Yi also met with his South Korean counterpart Jo Hyun earlier on Wednesday. Could you walk us through their talks?
Yeah, I found it quite significant. Wang Yi's first South Korea visit in 5 years, and maybe as a concrete result, Wang Yi also invited Jo Hyun back to a visit to China, which he gladly accepted. So the communication is going, and you have several topics that were really interested what they talked about. The most timely was probably the North Korea issue, but also bilaterally, they basically both pledged to increase ties in exchanges. That includes also people-to-people exchange. Both countries aim to achieve more than 10 million visits between each country. So that is the dimension that we talk about. And maybe the most concrete outcome was that Wang Yi said that Beijing is actively considering a visit, like basically that Myung gets invited to meet Xi Jinping possibly during the APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, that will take place in November in Shenzhen, in the south of China. Now, North Korea right now is the timely issue because there was a lot of dynamic, a lot of new developments happening with Trump, ordering to cut down the US-South Korea military drills and wanting, obviously, to meet Kim Jong-un. So Cho Yeon, the South Korean foreign minister, asked China to play a constructive role, also to bring North Korea back into dialogue. And clearly, China is the country that has the most political leverage over North Korea. And Wang Yi's answer was quite interesting. He repeated the official stance that China indeed plays a constructive role to promote peace and stability on the Korean peninsula. But, during a small Q&A with the press, when he was asked what concrete measures he will take, for example, to help that a Trump-Kim Jong-un meeting might be possible, then he basically backed off and was very vague and said that that's an issue between North Korea and the US. And he also, of course, took a jab at the US, saying that they should give up their hostile policy towards North Korea. So I think that was kind of to be expected, but it shows that there's a lot of lofty, lot of grand rhetoric, but when it comes to concrete measures, then I would say China is a little bit afraid to, burn their feet.
Broadly speaking, Thomas, what makes this latest interaction between the top diplomats of Seoul and Beijing important, do you think?
Well, just, and Fabian mentioned this as well. I mean, I think just on the most basic level, just the visit itself matters in the sense that, this is Wang Yi's first standalone visit to South Korea in 5 years. And, it just kind of signals that the high-level engagement between Seoul and Beijing is becoming more routine after, years when it was a more of a strained relationship. And we saw, she visited here last year for APEC, and then Myung visited China in January, and then you have Wang here in Seoul. So, we're seeing kind of a trajectory of a heightened, and they both sort of describe it as a kind of a more normalized relationship. So that in itself is important in the sense of, what that signals. And I think also, Fabian mentioned some of these topics. I mean, they do have a lot of bilateral issues, just obviously there's economic and trade issues are still, they're such major partners with each other. And so, I know Wang had emphasized talking about trade and cooperation in AI, green technology, digital economy, and, Seoul's readout also talked about trade, investment, supply chain stability. So they have all of those issues. And of course, where things stand though, regionally, as far as the relationship with North Korea, or just even kind of military and political alignments, I think obviously the relationship between Seoul and China has, gotten smoother or improved in the sense that, Myung has not gone as hard in the camp of Washington and had taken such a stronger stance against China. So there is this kind of trying to figure out how to keep, balance this or, find the lane between the two things. So, obviously South Korea is still, an ally and tied to Washington on security matters. But, Wang actually mentioned, talking about urging South Korea to pursue an independent foreign policy, he said, and develop relationships with different countries in parallel without conflict. So you can see where there's, this kind of push and pull about where will South Korea land in terms of, it's how closely it will, follow Washington in its foreign and, military policy, or will it be more open to maybe just independent. And obviously Beijing would like to see more of South Korea acting as a independent agent rather than being strictly tied to Washington. So, I think for Lee, it's a question of showing, strengthening relationships with Beijing, but not necessarily at the expense of the U.S. alliance. Whereas, obviously, but China remains such a large trading partner, an important player in the region. So, Seoul is trying to keep the relationship stable, and, China obviously has an interest in keeping the region stable as well.
Right. Thomas, before I ask you a follow-up question on that, first, Fabian, I asked you the same question. What one thing does Seoul gain from these latest talks between their top diplomats? And similarly, what does Beijing take away from these talks between their top diplomats?
Yeah, I can start with Beijing. If I have to choose one thing, then politically for Beijing, it's the most important thing that Seoul does not align too closely with the US. Basically, what China wants is that South Korea has some equidistance, basically will not go full to the US camp, but basically will also stay in the influence or the hemisphere of China. Basically, they want influence, political influence. Economically, China has also a strong interest to keep the market here in South Korea open for also their, for example, electric cars. I mean, right now, I think China is really depending on their exports, and they need markets to be open, especially a strong consumer market like the South Korean one. Vice versa, what does Seoul want? I think politically the most important thing for South Korea is they want to engage right now with North Korea, and through that they need China, because China has the power to influence North Korea if they would want to. Right now, I think there's not too much of a sign that China is putting a lot of effort to get North Korea back into dialogue, but I mean, theoretically they could do that. And economically, the thing that is important for South Korea, of course, is the huge Chinese market, 1.4 billion consumers, even though right now the economy is going a little bit sluggish in China, but there were a lot of trade barriers after a political fallout, roughly 10 years. The THAAD issue, I mean, I don't want to go too much into detail, but basically a lot of Korean companies who've been doing relatively well on the Chinese market then went sour. I mean, basically because of the political fallout. And now it's improving slightly, but I'm sure there's a lot of things to improve there on this front.
Right. Thomas, I'd now like to circle back to your comments earlier. So with Mr. Trump calling for the scaling back, of course, of joint defense drills with South Korea, does this particular trip by Wang perhaps provide Beijing with an opening, a new opening that would be, to reshape South Korea's strategic calculations? What have you been hearing on the ground?
Yeah, I think, you know, I wouldn't say it's an opening for kind of a strategic realignment, but yeah, I think just generally speaking, you know, this does give an opportunity to kind of, you know, again, as we've been talking about, you know, China has been pushing for this idea of Seoul pursuing more of an independent foreign policy. And so the idea that, you know, the US is coming across in this way as perhaps an unreliable or unpredictable, you know, military ally certainly gives some, you know, leverage or some strength to the argument coming from Beijing. I mean, it's hard to imagine, oh, Seoul will, you know, move strongly into Beijing's corner, but the idea that South Korea might, you know, want to really kind of double down on having more of its, you know, its own independent military policy. And I mean, that's already been happening. And I think, you know, as far as Myung has talked, you know, before these military exercises started, you know, again about wanting to make sure that this wartime operational control is transferred to South Korea by the end of his term. And, you know, he kind of doubled down on mentioning that again. And, you know, I think I've also just been hearing and seeing, you know, from sort of defense and security analysts, I mean, we've already seen kind of American allies starting to think about, you know, different regional alliances or more, you know, just sort of strengthening their own capacity. And kind of Japan, it's sort of seeing it happen as well there. So any of these sorts of openings, you know, I mean, China would love to see any kind of distance between the US and South Korea or Japan. So, you know, clearly this latest, you know, this week of you know, suddenly sort of canceling or, you know, reducing these military alliances is the kind of thing that, you know, even though South Korea has kind of responded, or the, you know, particularly the Lee administration has responded with sort of a positive spin in the sense of, oh, this could be an opportunity for us to re-engage with North Korea. So I do think there is a side that they see it as an opportunity, but, you know, longer term and sort of from a more just strictly a military and defense perspective, clearly it you know, rings some alarm bells about just, you know, you want sort of predictability with your main military partner. And so, you know, it really is not just South Korea, you know, Japan, you know, other countries are sort of creating, you know, finding their own little military partnerships and deals. So any of those things, I think China can see as being in its interest. So I think, you know, there's a crack maybe opening, but, you know, I wouldn't say, oh, it's something where South Korea is suddenly going to have a complete realignment.
Fabian, from a European perspective, is South Korea's attempt that is, to advance relations with Beijing a model perhaps of strategic hedging that US allies in Europe, like Germany, should be closely watching?
Well, to some degree, South Korea is proving that you don't have to choose a side necessarily, that you can improve ties with Beijing while still maintaining the security alliance with Washington. So you could frame it as some kind of role model also for other middle powers like Germany. But the situation for Europe right now is quite different. I mean, South Korea has a strong incentive to improve ties with China. I mean, they're direct neighbors. They have to get along. And there's, of course, the North Korea issue where China is a key potential mediator. The situation for Germany right now is quite different. I mean, parts of Europe, especially Germany, they face, I would say, a deindustrialization by the competition through China, a competition that is only partly fair, but also there's a lot of overreaching industrial policy. So right now in Europe, the relationship with China is really going sour. I think we are really very short before a trade war, a full escalation actually. So right now you cannot really compare the situation of the two things, but definitely Germany will closely watch what is happening here in South Korea and how South Korea will deal with China.
Right. Thomas, I wonder, how much leverage and willingness does Beijing actually have to help restart diplomacy with Pyongyang, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. China clearly has more leverage probably over North Korea than any other country. I mean, they're still their dominant trading partner, economic lifeline. I mean, they share this long border. I mean, they're probably, clearly North Korea's closest trading partner and ally. But, we've also seen North Korea having, a little bit more latitude, not being as solely reliant on China in recent years. Clearly, its relationship with Russia, its military partnership, has kind of given Kim, another outlet, and that's been bringing them, military technology and much needed, currency and an injection of cash. So it's not, North Korea is not as dependent solely on China. Yet, at the same time, we've seen, after it seemed a period when there was a little bit of cooling, we have seen the relationship seem to warm up between China and North Korea. Xi Jinping was in Pyongyang recently. Xi went to Beijing for the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. So, they've also been having a lot of high-level exchanges. So clearly, they're still very much in each other's orbit, but you might think China's leverage is not as strong as it was perhaps during Trump's first term when the U.S. and North Korea met. China also, there's a sort of limit to how much. I mean, I don't think they can just necessarily say you need to do this or not. As for their willingness to apply pressure, I mean, that's also a question. We've seen. Beijing has been kind of cautious about the way that they've dealt with North Korea. And, there's just a level at which they promote stability. They don't want kind of a, nuclear crisis or, sort of a war on the peninsula. And they have just, issues of a collapse of the North Korean regime, what that would mean in terms of sort of refugee crisis. And there's all those levels that, that it affects them in a kind of very direct way, that they favor stability. And, we saw Wang's comments here. He mentioned China playing a constructive role, but didn't really talk about, he basically pushed it on to the US and North Korea sort of having to figure out its own way forward, and mentioning the U.S. needs to change its hostile policy. So I think China has always has often maintained a little bit more of a cautious approach to sort of pushing too hard. But yeah, it's an interesting question as to how much leverage they currently have now.
All right. Fabian, when we look beyond the optics of this latest visit by Wang Yi toward perhaps the November APEC summit in China that you mentioned earlier, what concrete outcome from his latest visit to South Korea would signal that the two countries are indeed entering a new phase in the relationship?
Yeah, I find that question really good and important, because we have a lot of friendly rhetoric, especially by the Chinese side. That was remarkable, like what Wang Yi said. And but talk is cheap. I mean, we have to see some actions. What would be really a game changer is if the exchanges would be institutionalized. I give you some examples. I mean, if, for example, K-pop, Korean dramas, if Korean soft power can be openly exported to China again, because still K-pop bands face unofficial bans. I mean, not a strict boycott, but almost boycott that has gradually been lifted a little bit. But I think it's definitely not an open market for the Korean culture industry. That would be a major change. For example, if China would really open up towards Korean companies and especially towards pop culture. The other thing is if China would really use their influence over North Korea in a constructive way, then of course this would be really a paradigm shift, I would say. But right now, does China have a strong incentive? I mean, I would say if you look at the bigger picture, the strategic interests of South Korea and China, there are some fundamental differences which I think are hard to overcome. Recently, we've seen almost similar to the Cold War era, like two blocks that, Beijing, Pyongyang, Moscow, and to some degree also Tehran, they grow together, they supply each other with dual goods, they support each other indirectly also in war efforts. And then you have, of course, the West. I mean, it's not a unified bloc, but I think you see this polarization. And in this environment, it's really difficult to kind of manage and be good and have good relationship to everyone.
All right, quite a lot of uncertainty there then. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Fabian, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. Thomas, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right then, as Seoul and Beijing look to turn words into tangible action, the question now is whether this latest engagement can mark the start of a new chapter in their relationship. As always, thank you for watching. Do join us again same time tomorrow.